The notification chimed on my phone while I was watering my petunias. A Facebook post. James had tagged me in something. I set down the watering can and touched the screen with my dirt-stained finger. The image loaded slowly. My internet was always sluggish in the mornings. Then I saw it. My son James stood there in a black tuxedo, his arm wrapped around a petite blonde woman in flowing white silk. Her veil caught the sunlight. His smile stretched wide across his face, wider than I'd seen since he was 12 and caught his first fish. The caption underneath made my stomach drop. Just married. Best day of our lives. My coffee mug slipped from my other hand. The ceramic exploded against the flagstone patio, sending brown liquid across the stones like scattered blood. 24 years. 24 years of raising him after his father walked out. 24 years of scraped knees and bedtime stories, college applications and tuition payments I couldn't afford. And my son got married without telling me. I scrolled through the comments with trembling fingers. "Congratulations," one read. "Beautiful couple," said another. "So happy for you both." Strangers were celebrating while I sat alone in my backyard, learning about the most important day of my child's life through a social media post. The doorbell rang inside the house. I stumbled through the back door, stepping over coffee-soaked ceramic shards, my gardening gloves still dirty with soil. I opened the front door, and there he stood, my James. Same brown hair, same crooked smile, but something in his eyes had changed. Beside him stood the woman from the photo, smaller than I'd imagined, with sharp blue eyes and perfectly straight teeth. "Mom!" James pushed past me, dragging 2 massive suitcases behind him. "This is Madison. We're married now. Isn't that incredible?" Madison stepped forward and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, cold even in the morning heat. Her nails were painted pearl white, not a chip in sight. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice sweet as artificial honey. "James has told me absolutely everything about you." Lies. Every word was a lie. If James had told her everything, she'd know I hated being called Mrs. Patterson, that I'd kept my maiden name even during my brief marriage. She'd know I collected vintage teacups from estate sales. She'd know I'd been planning his wedding in my head since he was 5 years old, picking flowers and imagining walking him down the aisle. "We need to stay here for our honeymoon," James announced, already moving toward the guest bedroom like he still lived here. "Madison's apartment is getting fumigated for termites, and you know how expensive hotels are these days. I watched my son, my baby, follow this stranger down my hallway like she was pulling him on an invisible string." Madison paused at the entrance to the guest room and looked back at me over her shoulder. For just 1 second, her smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying me like I was something she needed to measure. Then the sweet expression returned, but I'd seen what lurked underneath. Cold calculation, hungry patience. This woman knew exactly what she was doing. But standing there in my own home, surrounded by broken coffee cup pieces and the smell of spilled dreams, I had no idea how far she was willing to go to get whatever it was she wanted from my family. Madison's suitcase hit the guest room floor with a heavy thud that shook my grandmother's china cabinet in the hallway. I was still standing in my front doorway, watching my son drag their luggage inside like a bellhop at some fancy hotel. The broken coffee mug pieces crunched under James's sneakers as he made his 3rd trip to the car. "This room is so quaint," Madison announced, her voice carrying that same artificial sweetness from our introduction. I followed the sound and found her standing in the center of my guest bedroom, hands on her hips, surveying the space like a general inspecting troops. Her pearl white nails drummed against her slim waist. Very vintage. The way she said vintage made it sound like a disease. I decorated that room myself over 20 years, choosing each piece carefully. The hand-stitched quilt my sister had made, the antique oak dresser I'd restored when James was in high school, the watercolor paintings of wildflowers I'd bought at the local art fair. Madison opened the first suitcase and began pulling out clothes designer blouses, silk scarves, shoes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She held up a delicate pink sweater and frowned at the oak dresser. "James, honey, could you help me move this somewhere else?" The wood grain clashes with my pastels. James immediately stepped forward, his face bright with eagerness. "Of course, sweetheart. Mom, where should we put it?" "Where should—" I stared at him. My son was asking me where to store my own furniture to accommodate a stranger's wardrobe. "It's been in that spot for 15 years, I managed to say. Madison's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson, I hope you don't mind me making a few tiny adjustments. I just want to feel at home during our stay." She placed her hand on James's arm, her fingers possessive. "After all, we're family now." Family. The word twisted in my chest. I watched Madison unpack her cosmetics, lining them up on my dresser like she was marking territory. Expensive bottles and jars pushed my few simple toiletries to one corner. A silk jewelry pouch appeared next, its contents spread across the surface I'd polished every Sunday for 2 decades. "The lighting in here is quite harsh," Madison observed, walking to the window and adjusting the blinds I'd positioned to let in morning sun. "And this wallpaper is very busy. Floral patterns went out of style ages ago." She turned to James with a helpless expression, her lower lip pushed out slightly. "Do you think your mother would mind if we made this space a little more modern? Just while we're here?" James nodded before I could respond. "Mom's very understanding about these things. Aren't you, Mom?" Understanding. I'd been understanding when he dropped out of pre-med. Understanding when he moved across the country for a job that lasted 6 months. Understanding when he borrowed money for his security deposit and never paid it back. Now I was supposed to be understanding about a stranger redecorating my home. "I'll just grab some tools from the garage," James said, already heading for the door. "We can take down that wallpaper this afternoon." The door closed behind him, leaving Madison and me alone. She continued unpacking, humming softly to herself. Her movements were precise, calculated. Each item had its designated place in her new arrangement. She folded James's clothes neatly in the bottom drawer, but hung her own dresses in the prime closet space. "You know," she said without looking at me, "James told me you've been lonely since his father left." Her fingers smoothed a wrinkle from a silk blouse. "It must be nice having some company in this big house." I hadn't told James I was lonely. I'd told him I enjoyed my solitude, my quiet mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles, my evening gardening routine. Madison was fishing for information, but I couldn't understand why. "James worries about you," she continued, opening another suitcase. "He says you forget things sometimes, lose track of time. He's such a caring son. Forget things, lose track of time." These were lies wrapped in concern, and I recognized the pattern from when James was teenager, trying to cover for staying out past curfew. But now the lies were about me, spoken by a woman who'd known my son for God knows how long while keeping me completely in the dark. Madison pulled out a framed photo, their wedding picture, and placed it prominently on the nightstand. The same image that had shattered my morning, now claiming space in my own home. She stepped back and admired her handiwork, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. "There," she said. "Much better." By evening, Madison had transformed more than just the guest room. I found my latest issue of Better Homes and Gardens in the kitchen trash, along with 2 cooking magazines I hadn't finished reading. When I retrieved them, Madison appeared beside me at the garbage can. "Oh, those old things." She touched her chest in mock concern. "I thought you were done with them. They were just cluttering the coffee table." Her head tilted sympathetically. "James mentioned you sometimes have trouble keeping up with housework. I was just trying to help." "James mentioned," James said. "James told me." Every sentence that came from Madison's mouth included my son's name, as if his words gave her authority over my life. But James had never said I was forgetful or messy or struggling with housework. These were Madison's inventions, designed for some purpose I couldn't yet grasp. I carried my magazines back to the living room and found Madison adjusting my thermostat. She'd lowered it to 68 degrees. My arthritis always flared in the cold, and I'd kept the house at a comfortable 72 for years. "Madison," I said, watching her manicured finger move the dial. "I prefer it warmer." She turned with wide, innocent eyes. "Oh, I run hot, always have. James does too. It's one of the things we have in common." She laughed softly. "I hope you don't mind. We'll only be here a few days." But when James walked into the room carrying a glass of water for his new wife, Madison's expression shifted. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice became small and wounded. "James, I think I've upset your mother. I only adjusted the temperature because I was feeling a little warm, but maybe I overstepped." James immediately moved to Madison's side, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Mom, Madison was just trying to be comfortable. Can't we compromise?" Compromise? I was being asked to compromise on the temperature in my own home while this stranger had already thrown away my magazines and rearranged my furniture. But James's face held that same hopeful expression he'd worn as a child, asking for a later bedtime or extra dessert money. "Of course," I heard myself say. Madison's tears disappeared instantly. She squeezed James's hand and gave me a grateful smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. You're so kind to let us adjust to married life here." James beamed at both of us like he'd negotiated world peace. "See? I knew you two would get along perfectly." After dinner takeout Chinese food that Madison had suggested because my home cooking was too heavy for her delicate stomach, I sat in my living room trying to read. Madison and James had gone to the guest room early, claiming exhaustion from their big day. But as I turned the pages of my novel, their voices carried through the thin walls. I tried to ignore them at first. Newlyweds deserved privacy, even newlyweds who'd excluded me from their wedding day. But something in Madison's tone made me pause. Gone was the sweet, helpless voice she'd used all afternoon. This voice was crisp, businesslike. I closed my book and moved closer to the guest room door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The voices became clearer. "Definitely has assets," Madison was saying. "The house alone is worth at least $300,000, probably more in this neighborhood." My blood turned cold. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, straining to hear more. "And you said she doesn't have any other family?" Madison continued. "Just me." James's voice sounded different, too tired, uncertain. "But Madison, I don't understand why we need to shh." Madison's tone shifted to honey again. "Don't worry about the details, sweetheart. I'll handle everything." "How long do you think it might take? How long for what? For her to really start needing help? You said she's already showing signs." "Signs? What signs?" I'd been living independently for 15 years, managing my finances, maintaining my home, driving myself to doctor appointments and grocery stores. What signs was my son describing to this woman? Footsteps approached the door from inside the room. I hurried back to my chair, grabbing my book and pretending to read as the guest room door opened slightly. "James, could you get me some water?" Madison's voice was sweet again, performing for an audience she couldn't see. "And maybe some of those crackers from the kitchen? All this excitement has made me a little queasy." "Of course, sweetheart. Anything you need." James's footsteps headed toward the kitchen. I waited, listening to Madison move around the guest room, but she remained silent until James returned. Then the soft murmur of conversation resumed, too quiet for me to make out individual words. I sat there in my reading chair, the same chair where I'd nursed James through fevers, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd fallen asleep waiting for him to come home safely from teenage adventures. The wedding photo on the nightstand in the guest room seemed to stare at me through the walls, a reminder that my son now belonged to someone else. Someone who discussed my assets like items in an estate sale catalog. Someone who asked how long it might take for me to need help, as if my independence was a temporary obstacle to overcome. I turned off the living room lamp and made my way to my bedroom, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house, every whisper from the guest room made me strain to listen. The darkness pressed against my windows like a living thing, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering who Madison had been talking to earlier and what exactly they were planning. The wedding photo haunted my thoughts. Two strangers smiling at a camera while my son's real life, his real family, had been carefully erased from the frame. Now they were here, in my home, discussing my future as if I were already gone. I pulled my quilt up to my chin and tried to remember the last time James had visited without wanting something. Money for rent, a place to stay between jobs, advice about girlfriends who never seemed to last more than a few months. When had he started seeing me as someone who needed help instead of someone who had always helped him? The house settled around me with familiar sounds, but they offered no comfort. Madison's voice echoed in my memory, businesslike and cold, discussing timelines and assets while my son slept beside her, apparently unaware that his new wife was already planning my future. In the darkness of my own bedroom, surrounded by 40 years of memories and photographs, I realized that the stranger in my guest room wasn't just rearranging my furniture. She was rearranging my entire life, with my son's unwitting help, towards some goal that chilled me more than the lowered thermostat ever could. Madison's heels clicked across my kitchen floor at 7 a.m, each step sharp and deliberate like a metronome marking time. She wore a powder blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill, her hair swept into a perfect chignon that hadn't moved since yesterday. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and morning crossword, trying to pretend her presence didn't make my skin crawl. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," she chirped, opening my refrigerator like she'd been doing it for years. "What a lovely day for your bridge club. James told me you play every Wednesday. I hadn't mentioned bridge club to James in months. We used to talk about everything, my weekly routines, my friends, my small victories and frustrations. But lately, our conversations had become shorter, more distant. Now this stranger knew my schedule better than my own son did. "I'd love to come with you today," Madison continued, pulling out my orange juice and pouring herself a glass without asking. "I'm so excited to meet your friends." My fingers tightened around my coffee mug. Bridge Club was my sanctuary, the one place where I was still Ruth Patterson instead of James's aging mother who needed managing. Dorothy, Helen, and Susan had been my friends for over a decade. They knew my mind was sharp, my memory intact, my opinions worth hearing. "I don't think that's necessary," I said carefully. Madison's face fell like a disappointed child's. "Oh, I just thought it would be nice to get to know the important people in your life." She set down the juice glass with a soft clink. "James will be so disappointed. He was hoping I could keep an eye on you during your outing. Keep an eye on me. I'd been driving to Bridge Club alone for 10 years, navigating the same route twice a week, parking in the same spot at the community center. When had I become someone who needed supervision? "Of course you can come," I heard myself saying, though every instinct screamed against it. Madison's smile returned instantly, brighter than before. "Wonderful. I'll go get ready." At the community center, Madison transformed. Gone was the calculating woman who'd reorganized my home and discussed my assets like commodity prices. In her place stood a charming, devoted daughter-in-law who seemed genuinely delighted to meet my friends. "Mrs. Patterson, your friends are absolutely lovely," Madison gushed as we approached the card table where Dorothy, Helen, and Susan waited. She'd started calling me Mrs. Patterson exclusively now, even though I'd asked her twice to use Ruth. I can see where James gets his wonderful taste in people. Dorothy looked up from shuffling the deck, her silver hair perfectly styled as always. "Ruth, you didn't tell us James had gotten married." Heat crept up my neck. It was very sudden. A whirlwind romance, Madison added, settling into the empty chair with graceful movements. James swept me off my feet so quickly we barely had time to plan a ceremony. We kept it very small, just immediate family. The lie slipped from her lips as easily as breathing. I wasn't immediate family, apparently. Or maybe Madison had redefined the term to exclude inconvenient mothers-in-law. Helen dealt the first hand with practiced efficiency. How exciting. Ruth must have been thrilled to help with the wedding planning. Madison's laugh tinkled like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Oh, Mrs. Patterson has been having some challenges lately with organizing events. Haven't you, dear? She reached over and patted my hand with false sympathy. James and I thought it would be less stressful for her if we handled everything ourselves. Challenges with organizing events. I'd planned my church's annual fundraiser for 5 years running. Last Christmas, I'd coordinated a food drive that fed 30 families. But Madison's words planted seeds of doubt in my friends' expressions, and I watched their faces change subtly. Well, Susan said carefully, the important thing is that you're happy. We played 3 hands before Madison struck again. I just made a successful bid when she leaned forward with apparent concern. Mrs. Patterson, you didn't play that ace we discussed. Remember, we talked about saving it for later? Her voice was gentle, patient, the tone people use with confused children. We hadn't discussed any ace. I'd played my hand according to standard strategy, the same way I'd played for years. But Madison's comment made it sound like I was following instructions she'd given me, like I couldn't manage a simple card game without guidance. Dorothy raised an eyebrow. Ruth's always been sharp at bridge. Oh, absolutely, Madison agreed quickly. She's still quite good most of the time. It's just that sometimes she gets a little turned around, don't you, dear? Her smile never wavered. James says it's completely normal for someone her age. Someone her age. I was 71, not 91. My mind was as clear as it had ever been, but Madison's gentle, concerned tone made my competence sound like a lucky accident rather than decades of experience. The next hand went worse. I made a perfectly reasonable play, but Madison sighed softly and shook her head with loving exasperation. She's been making some interesting choices lately, Madison confided to the other women, her voice low enough that I had to strain to hear. James is getting worried. Yesterday, she threw away some important magazines and then insisted someone else had done it. My cheeks burned. I hadn't thrown away the magazines Madison had, then blamed me for confusion when I retrieved them from the trash. But her version sounded believable, even reasonable. Why would a devoted daughter-in-law lie about such things? Helen looked at me with new concern. Ruth, are you feeling all right? I'm fine, I said, but my voice came out sharper than I intended, defensive in a way that made me sound exactly like someone who wasn't fine. Madison immediately placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Of course you are, dear. We all have our difficult days. She turned to my friends with a martyred expression. It's been an adjustment for all of us. James and I are just trying to be supportive. By the time we finished playing, my friends were looking at me with pity instead of the respect I'd earned over decades of friendship. They spoke to me more slowly, more carefully, as if I might break or become confused if they used too many complicated words. You're lucky to have such a caring daughter-in-law, Dorothy said as we prepared to leave. Lucky. I felt anything but lucky as Madison helped me gather my purse and sweater, her assistance unnecessary but performed for our audience. She was building a narrative about my decline, and my own friends were becoming unwitting actors in her story. The drive home passed in tense silence. Madison hummed softly to herself, apparently pleased with her performance. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to process what had just happened. In 2 hours, she'd undermined my competence, my independence, and my relationships with some of my closest friends. Back home, the subtle attacks continued. I went to my desk to pay bills and found my checkbook missing. I searched the usual places, desk drawers, kitchen counter, my purse, but it had vanished. Looking for something? Madison appeared in the doorway to my home office, her head tilted with innocent curiosity. My checkbook. I always keep it in the top drawer. Madison's brow furrowed with concern. Oh dear, you used it yesterday to pay the grocery delivery person, remember? Maybe you put it somewhere safe and forgot. I hadn't paid any grocery delivery person. We'd picked up Chinese takeout for dinner, and I'd used cash from my wallet. But Madison's suggestion sounded so reasonable, so gentle, that I began to doubt my own memory. Let's look together, she offered, stepping into the office with helpful enthusiasm. We searched for 20 minutes before Madison triumphantly discovered my checkbook tucked behind the coffee maker in the kitchen. Here it is, she announced, holding it up like a prize. You must have set it down when you were making coffee this morning. I stared at the checkbook. I hadn't been near the coffee maker with it, had never used that spot for paperwork in 40 years of living in this house. But Madison's explanation sounded logical, and her smile was so patient, so understanding. These things happen, she said, handing me the checkbook with gentle sympathy. James mentioned you've been having some memory lapses lately. Memory lapses. James had mentioned this to Madison, apparently. My own son was discussing my mental state with his new wife, sharing concerns he'd never voiced to me directly. 2 days later, my reading glasses disappeared from their usual spot on my nightstand. I found them in the refrigerator, tucked behind a carton of milk. Then my car keys vanished, only to reappear in the bathroom medicine cabinet. Each time, Madison was nearby with helpful explanations and patient smiles. Maybe we should make a doctor's appointment, she suggested after the car keys incident. Just to check on your memory. James is getting really worried. James nodded from across the living room, his face creased with concern. Mom, you do seem a little scattered lately. Maybe Madison's right. Scattered. My son thought I was scattered, but I knew I wasn't losing my mind. Someone was moving my belongings, creating chaos in my organized life, then offering solutions to problems they'd created. The morning I caught Madison in my home office, her phone camera pointed at my desk, everything clicked into place. She stood with her back to the doorway, photographing documents spread across my workspace. Bank statements, insurance policies, investment portfolios, my entire financial life captured in digital images. What are you doing? I demanded from the doorway. Madison spun around, her phone clutched to her chest. For just a moment, her mask slipped. Her eyes were cold, calculating, caught in the act. Then the sweet smile returned, and she held up her phone like it was perfectly normal. Oh, Mrs. Patterson, you startled me. I was just trying to help organize your paperwork. She gestured at the scattered documents with apparent helpfulness. Poor James is so worried about your finances. He asked me to take some pictures so we could help you get everything sorted. Another lie wrapped in concern. James had never expressed worry about my finances because I'd never given him reason to. I managed my money carefully, paid bills on time, maintained detailed records, but Madison made it sound like I was on the verge of financial collapse. I don't need help with my finances, I said evenly. Madison's expression shifted to gentle sympathy. Of course not, dear. But James thinks it might be good to have a backup system, just in case. You know how much he loves you. She began gathering the papers, her movements quick and efficient. But I'd seen enough. Madison had been photographing my bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to my house. She knew my account balances, my investments, my net worth down to the penny. James doesn't know about my finances, I said, watching her face carefully. Well, no, Madison admitted, still organizing papers with helpful enthusiasm. But he's concerned about your future security. We both are. It's wonderful that you've been so responsible. But at your age, it's important to have help managing these complicated documents. At my age, complicated documents. Madison was building a case for my incompetence while gathering intelligence about my assets. But why did a newlywed need detailed photographs of her mother-in-law's financial records? That evening, as I lay in bed listening to the soft murmur of voices from the guest room, I realized Madison had mapped my entire financial situation with surgical precision. She knew my bank balances, insurance policies, investment accounts, and property values. She probably understood my financial position better than I did after years of careful management. The photographs on her phone contained everything someone would need to assess my worth, plan for my future, or convince others that I needed help managing my affairs. But a loving daughter-in-law wouldn't need such detailed documentation unless she was planning something that required proof of my assets and evidence of my alleged decline. I stared at the ceiling and wondered who else had seen those photographs, who else was studying my financial records in the darkness while I slept in my own home. Madison had turned my life into a case study, complete with documentation and witness testimony from my own friends. And somewhere in the guest room, she was probably taking more pictures, gathering more evidence, building whatever case she needed for whatever plan was taking shape in the shadows of my own house. The sound came at 3 a.m, a metallic scraping from my backyard like someone dragging something heavy across concrete. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The noise stopped, then started again. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I slipped out of bed and padded to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The motion sensor light flickered on, illuminating my garden shed. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the night breeze. I'd locked that shed before dinner. I always locked it. I grabbed my robe and house slippers, easing my bedroom door open as quietly as possible. The hallway stretched dark and silent. James and Madison's room showed no light under the door. I made my way through the kitchen, my hand trembling slightly as I turned the back door handle. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped onto the patio. The motion light blazed bright as daylight, and I could see my shed door clearly now. It wasn't just open. It was hanging from one hinge, like someone had forced it. My gardening tools were scattered across the lawn. Mrs. Patterson? Madison's voice behind me made me jump. I spun around to find her standing in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the late hour. "What are you doing out here?" "Someone broke into my shed," I said, pointing at the scattered tools. I heard noises. Madison stepped onto the patio, her slippers making soft clicking sounds on the concrete. She surveyed the scene with what looked like genuine concern, but something in her posture seemed too alert for someone who'd just woken up. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice pitched high with worry. James, come quickly." Within minutes, my son appeared in pajamas and bare feet, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked genuinely startled, unlike Madison, who seemed wide awake and fully composed. "Mom, what happened?" James asked, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "I heard someone in the yard," I explained. "They broke into the shed." Madison walked over to examine the shed door, her movements careful and deliberate. "The lock doesn't look forced," she observed, holding up the intact padlock, "and there's no sign of damage to the door frame." I stared at the lock in her hand. She was right. It wasn't broken or bent. But I distinctly remembered locking that shed after watering my tomatoes yesterday evening. The routine was as automatic as breathing. "Maybe you forgot to lock it?" James suggested gently. "The wind could have blown it open." "The door is hanging off its hinge," I protested. "Wind doesn't do that." Madison crouched down and examined the hinge more closely. "Actually, this looks like old damage. See how rusted the metal is? This hinge has been loose for a while." She stood up and brushed dirt from her hands. "Mrs. Patterson, are you sure you heard someone out here?" Maybe it was just the door finally giving way. James nodded, accepting Madison's explanation immediately. "Mom, you know that shed is old. We should have replaced those hinges years ago." I looked at the scattered tools, the damaged door, the concerned faces of my son and his wife. Everything Madison said sounded reasonable, logical, but I knew I'd heard deliberate noises, purposeful sounds that didn't match a door simply falling apart. Maybe I was confused, I heard myself saying, though every instinct screamed against it. Madison smiled and patted my arm with gentle sympathy. "It happens to all of us. Strange noises at night can play tricks on our minds. The next morning, I woke to find Madison sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, making notes in neat handwriting. She'd changed the locks on my front and back doors while I slept, explaining to James that it was for security after the incident in the garden. "I've been thinking about last night," she said as I poured my coffee. "Maybe we should consider having someone stay with you during the day, just until you're feeling more settled." Settled. I'd lived in this house for 25 years. I'd never been more settled anywhere in my life. But Madison's tone suggested I was a temporary resident who might need to be relocated. "That's not necessary," I said. James looked up from his phone. "Actually, Mom, Madison might have a point. You did seem pretty disoriented last night." Disoriented. My son was using Madison's vocabulary now, describing me with her words. I sat down at my own kitchen table and felt like a stranger in my own home. "I could make some calls," Madison offered, her pen poised over the legal pad. "Find someone who specializes in companion care for seniors." Companion care. The phrase made my skin crawl. I was 71, not 91. I drove myself to appointments, managed my finances, maintained my home, cooked my own meals. But Madison was building a case for my incompetence, one incident at a time. Over the next week, my isolation became complete. Phone calls that used to come regularly simply stopped. When I mentioned this to Madison, she explained that she'd been filtering my communications to reduce stress. "Dorothy called yesterday while you were napping," Madison said, not looking up from the magazine she was reading. "I told her you weren't feeling up to visitors." She seemed to understand. Dorothy and I had spoken twice a week for 10 years. She wouldn't simply accept being turned away without asking questions. Unless Madison had convinced her that my condition was worse than it actually was. "What exactly did you tell her?" I asked. Madison set down her magazine with a patient sigh. "Just that you've been having some challenges lately and need rest." She was very understanding. She said to tell you she's praying for you. Praying for me. Dorothy thought I was dying or losing my mind. Madison had poisoned that relationship with just a few well-chosen words, words that sounded caring but effectively cut me off from one of my closest friends. My mail began arriving later in the day, already opened. Madison explained that she was helping me manage correspondence, sorting important items from junk mail. But I noticed that letters from my bank, my insurance company, and my doctor's office all seemed to disappear entirely. "I took care of those for you," Madison would say when I asked about missing mail. "No need to worry about boring paperwork." When I missed my regular doctor's appointment, Madison explained that she'd rescheduled it because I'd mixed up the dates again. Dr. Martinez's office had been very understanding about my confusion, she assured me. "We rescheduled for next month," Madison said, marking something on her ever-present legal pad. "That should give us time to get you feeling more like yourself, more like myself." According to Madison, I wasn't myself anymore. I was some diminished version that needed management, protection, and constant supervision. James seemed to accept all of this without question. He watched Madison organize my life with grateful admiration, thanking her for taking such good care of his mother. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with pity, like I was already disappearing before his eyes. "Madison's been such a blessing," he told me one evening. "I don't know what we'd do without her help. We, James and Madison, had become a team, and I was their project, their problem to solve." The legal documents appeared on a Thursday morning. Madison spread them across my kitchen table while James sat beside her, his coffee growing cold as he studied the papers. "It's just a precaution," Madison explained, her finger tracing lines of text. "A power of attorney arrangement so James can help you with financial decisions when you're not feeling up to it." I stared at the document's official forms with legal seals and spaces for signatures. The language was dense, complicated, filled with terms I didn't fully understand. "I can manage my own finances," I said. "Of course you can," Madison agreed quickly. "This is just backup, for those days when you're feeling overwhelmed. James loves you so much, he just wants to make sure you're protected." James nodded earnestly. "Mom, you know I'd never do anything to hurt you. This is just paperwork, really. Madison found a lawyer who specializes in elder care. He explained everything to us. A lawyer. Madison had already consulted an attorney about my affairs without telling me. They'd discussed my finances, my competence, my future, all while I slept in my own house. His name is Robert Miller, Madison continued, pulling a business card from her purse. He's helped lots of families navigate these kinds of transitions. He said this type of arrangement is very common for people in your situation, my situation. I studied Robert Miller's business card, sleek, professional, with a downtown address that suggested expensive rates. Under his name, the card read, Elder Law Specialist in gold lettering. What exactly is my situation? I asked. Madison and James exchanged a meaningful look, one of those married couple communications that excluded me entirely. Mom, James said gently, you've been struggling lately. The confusion, the memory issues, getting disoriented in your own backyard. Madison thinks it would be helpful to have some legal protections in place. Madison thinks. My son was making decisions about my life based on the opinions of a woman he'd known for maybe 6 months, a woman who'd never spoken to my doctor or witnessed my supposed decline firsthand. I'd like to read these documents first, I said, reaching for the papers. Madison pulled them back slightly, her smile never wavering. Of course, dear, but they're quite technical. Mr. Miller said he'd be happy to explain everything to you in person. He's coming by tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow afternoon. They'd already scheduled a meeting in my home with a lawyer I'd never met to discuss legal arrangements I didn't want. My own kitchen table was becoming a conference room for planning my future without my input. That evening, I waited until I heard the soft murmur of conversation from the guest room before sneaking to my home office. I turned on my computer and opened the internet browser, hoping to research Robert Miller and understand what kind of lawyer I was dealing with. The browser history made my blood freeze. Someone had been using my computer to search for information I would never seek. Conservatorship laws, removing elderly from their homes, proving mental incompetence in court, elder care facilities near me, page after page of searches, all focused on stripping elderly people of their independence and moving them into institutions. The searches weren't random curiosity, they were systematic research, like someone was building a case or following a procedure they'd used before. I scrolled down further and found more searches. Power of attorney versus guardianship, how to document memory loss, elder abuse investigations avoiding. The last search made my hands shake as I read it. Someone had been using my own computer to research how to take control of my life while avoiding detection by authorities who might investigate elder abuse. But the computer was in my locked home office, accessible only to people with intimate knowledge of my daily routines. I minimized the browser and sat back in my desk chair, staring at the wedding photo James had placed next to my computer monitor. Madison smiled back at me from the frame, her arm possessive around my son's waist. Behind the photo, I noticed a small stack of legal pamphlets I'd never seen before, brochures for assisted living facilities, and information about memory care units. The pamphlets were arranged neatly beside my computer, like someone wanted me to find them, like they were part of a carefully orchestrated plan to convince me that moving out of my home was not just necessary, but inevitable. I turned off the computer and made my way back to my bedroom, but sleep was impossible. The browser history played in my mind like a roadmap to my destruction. Each search term another step in a plan I was only beginning to understand. Someone had been systematically researching how to take control of my life, my home, and my finances, while making it look like loving care instead of calculated theft. And that someone was sleeping in my guest room, probably dreaming of the moment when I'd be safely tucked away in some facility while she enjoyed the fruits of her careful planning. The grocery store parking lot stretched empty under the afternoon sun when I watched James's car disappear around the corner. Madison had insisted they go shopping together for proper food since my pantry was apparently inadequate for their refined tastes. I stood at my living room window, counting to 60 before grabbing my purse and heading for Eleanor's house next door. Eleanor Martinez had been my neighbor for 8 years. She was a retired librarian with the sharpest internet research skills of anyone I'd ever met. More importantly, she was the only person I knew who might still believe that my mind was perfectly intact. Ruth. Eleanor opened her door before I could knock, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. I was wondering when you'd come by. I haven't seen you at the mailbox in days. I need to use your computer, I said without preamble. There's something I have to research, and I can't do it at home. Eleanor's brown eyes studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades helping people find the information they needed. She stepped aside without another word, leading me to her home office where a modern computer sat ready on an oak desk that would have impressed Madison. "What are we looking for?" Eleanor asked, pulling up a second chair. "My son's new wife. Her name is Madison, but I think she might be using a false identity." Eleanor's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "What makes you think that?" I told her about the browser searches on my computer, the systematic isolation, the lawyer consultation I'd never requested. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Let's start with the basics," she said, opening a search engine. "What's her full name?" "Madison Patterson now, I suppose. Before that, I don't know. She's never mentioned her maiden name." Eleanor typed quickly, pulling up social media profiles and public records. We found James's Facebook page easily enough, but Madison's profile was sparse, created just 8 months ago with only a handful of photos. No family pictures, no childhood friends, no history beyond the time she'd apparently met my son. "This is odd," Eleanor murmured, scrolling through the limited profile. "Most people have years of digital history, photos with friends, tagged locations, shared memories. Madison's profile looks like it was created specifically to attract someone like James." We dug deeper, using reverse image searches on Madison's profile photos. The pictures were professional quality, the kind you'd see in stock photography or modeling portfolios. But the reverse search yielded nothing. No other websites, no modeling agencies, no traces of these images existing anywhere else online. "Let me try a different approach," Eleanor said, switching to a people search website. "We'll look for women around Madison's age with similar physical descriptions in your state." The search results filled the screen dozens of profiles, most with complete family histories and background information. Eleanor scrolled slowly, comparing faces to Madison's photo from James's wedding post. Then we found her. "Wait," Eleanor said, her finger hovering over the mouse. "Look at this one." The photo showed a woman who looked remarkably similar to Madison, but with darker hair and a slightly different nose. The profile listed her name as Melissa Hartwell, age 32, with a criminal record that made my stomach drop. "Fraud charges," Eleanor read aloud. "Financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Identity theft. She served 18 months in prison 3 years ago." I stared at the screen. The woman in this photo could have been Madison's twin, or Madison herself with subtle cosmetic changes. Same bone structure, same calculating eyes, same practiced smile. "Can you find more information about her crimes?" I asked. Eleanor clicked through to court records and newspaper archives. The story that emerged painted a picture of systematic predation that felt sickeningly familiar. Melissa Hartwell had targeted elderly victims by first seducing their adult children, lonely sons and daughters desperate for companionship. She'd move in quickly, establish herself as a caregiver, then systematically drain her victims' assets through forged documents and fraudulent power of attorney agreements. She stole over $200,000 from her last victim, Eleanor read from a newspaper article, an elderly man named William Garrett. His son testified that Melissa convinced him his father needed constant care, then moved into the family home and isolated the victim from friends and family. The details were identical to my own situation. The isolation, the gaslighting, the helpful daughter-in-law act that masked systematic theft. But William Garrett's story had a darker ending than mine. So far. "What happened to William Garrett?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Eleanor clicked through several more articles before finding the follow-up story. He died 6 months after Melissa moved in. Natural causes officially, but there were questions about medication interactions and missed doctor appointments. The family suspected neglect but couldn't prove it. My hands trembled as Eleanor continued reading. William Garrett had died alone in his own home while his assets were being systematically transferred to accounts controlled by Melissa Hartwell. His son had been convinced that his father was receiving excellent care right up until the funeral. "There's more," Eleanor said grimly, opening another browser tab. "I'm finding references to similar cases in 3 different states. Same pattern, same methods. Look at this forum." The website was called Elder Fraud Survivors, and it contained dozens of testimonials from families who'd been victimized by sophisticated financial predators. Eleanor clicked on a thread titled "The Caregiver Scam" and scrolled through posts that could have described my exact situation. My mother's helper convinced us she needed full-time care. One post read, "Within 6 months, Mom's bank accounts were empty and she was dead from complications." We never saw a penny of her money again. Another post described a woman named Michelle Hartwell who'd targeted a family in Arizona. The physical description matched Madison perfectly, right down to the pearl-white manicured nails and expensive taste in clothing. She's using different first names, I realized. Madison, Melissa, Michelle, but always the same last name, Hartwell. Eleanor bookmarked the forum and opened a new search, looking for any connections between Melissa Hartwell and lawyers who specialized in elder care. What we found made the scope of the operation clear. Robert Miller's name appeared in multiple court cases involving conservatorship disputes. In each case, he'd represented adult children seeking legal control over elderly parents who'd been declared mentally incompetent. The pattern was always the same. A concerned family member, usually guided by a helpful caregiver, would petition for conservatorship, citing declining mental health. The elderly person would be moved to a facility, their assets would be managed by the new conservator, and somehow significant portions of their wealth would disappear into legal fees and care expenses. "Look at this," Eleanor said, pointing to a financial document she'd found. Miller's law firm received payments totaling $50,000 from accounts controlled by Melissa Hartwell over the past 2 years. Payment records showed a clear partnership. Miller would handle the legal aspects of gaining control over elderly victims, while Melissa provided the ground-level manipulation and evidence gathering needed to support incompetency claims. Together, they'd perfected a system of legal theft that appeared completely legitimate on paper. "She's done this at least 4 times, Eleanor said, compiling a list of victims from court records and news articles. Always the same pattern. Seduce a lonely adult child, move in with the elderly parent, document signs of mental decline, petition for conservatorship through Miller's firm, then systematically drain the assets while the victim is warehoused in a care facility. The scope of Madison's operation was breathtaking. This wasn't impulsive greed or opportunistic theft. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple families while generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen wealth. "We need to print all of this," I said. Evidence, court records, everything. Eleanor's printer whirred to life, producing page after page of documentation that proved Madison was actually Melissa Hartwell, a convicted felon fraudster with a history of targeting elderly victims through their adult children. But as the papers stacked up, I realized how little time I might have to act on this information. According to the forum posts, Eleanor said, studying the timeline patterns, she usually moves from establishing control to filing conservatorship papers within 6 to 8 weeks. "How long has she been in your house?" I counted back from the day I discovered their marriage on Facebook. 3 weeks. "Then you probably have 2 or 3 weeks before she makes her legal move," Eleanor said grimly. "After that, everything becomes much harder to stop." We spent another hour documenting everything we'd found. Eleanor helped me create copies of all the evidence, storing them in multiple locations, including her own home office and a safety deposit box at her bank. By the time we finished, I had a complete dossier proving that Madison was a serial predator who'd targeted my family as her next victims. "What are you going to do with this information?" Eleanor asked as she walked me to her front door. "I'm going to show James," I said. "He has to see who he really married." But when I crossed the yard back to my own house, I found James and Madison in the living room with several shopping bags and a man I didn't recognize. The stranger was middle-aged, Asian, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly income. He had the smooth, professional demeanor of someone accustomed to handling delicate family situations. "Mom," James called out when I entered. Perfect timing. "This is Robert Miller, the lawyer Madison found to help us with your paperwork." Robert Miller extended his hand with practiced charm. "Mrs. Patterson, I've heard so much about you. Madison and James are wonderful advocates for your care and protection." I shook his hand mechanically, my mind reeling from the sudden appearance of Madison's criminal partner in my own living room. Miller's smile was warm, professional, completely believable. If I hadn't spent the afternoon researching his history of legal theft, I would have found him trustworthy and competent. "Mr. Miller specializes in helping families navigate difficult transitions," Madison added, her voice filled with false gratitude. "He's explained how the power of attorney process works, and he thinks we can have everything settled within a few days." A few days. The timeline was accelerating faster than Eleanor had predicted. Miller and Madison were moving quickly, probably because they'd sensed some resistance or concern that threatened their operation. "I'd like to review the documents first," I said carefully, still clutching my purse that contained copies of all the evidence Eleanor and I had gathered. "Of course," Miller said smoothly. "But I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor. These legal arrangements work best when they're put in place before any further confusion or cognitive decline occurs. Madison has been documenting some concerning incidents, and we want to make sure you're protected." Documenting incidents. Madison had been building a legal case against me, creating evidence of incompetence to support the conservatorship petition that would rob me of everything I'd worked for over 70 years. "What kind of incidents?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Madison pulled out her ever-present legal pad, now filled with neat handwriting that chronicled my supposed decline. The confusion in the garden, misplacing important items, difficulty managing social interactions at bridge club, problems with routine tasks like organizing mail. Each item on her list was a twisted version of situations she'd created or manipulated. But presented by a lawyer and a concerned daughter-in-law, they painted a picture of progressive mental deterioration that would convince any judge to grant conservatorship. "We've also installed some security measures," James added proudly. "Madison thought it would be good to have cameras around the house, just to make sure you're safe when we're not here." Cameras. I looked around my living room and noticed small, discreet devices mounted in corners I hadn't examined closely before. Madison had turned my own home into a surveillance system, recording my every move to gather more evidence for their legal case. "The cameras will help document your daily routines," Miller explained. "Courts like to see objective evidence of care needs and safety concerns. They were recording me in my own house, building a video library of anything that might support their claim that I needed a conservator to manage my affairs. And once Miller filed his petition, those recordings would become evidence in a legal proceeding that could strip me of every right I'd ever had." "I think we've covered enough for today," I said, setting my purse down carefully and trying to appear calm. "This is all very overwhelming." Madison immediately moved to my side with fake concern. "Of course it is, dear. These legal matters are so complicated. That's why it's wonderful to have professionals like Mr. Miller helping us navigate everything." Miller gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. "I'll prepare the initial documents and bring them by tomorrow afternoon. Once Mrs. Patterson signs the power of attorney, we can begin the process of ensuring her long-term security and care." Long-term security and care. The euphemisms rolled off Miller's tongue like poetry, but I knew they meant systematic theft and eventual warehousing in some facility where I'd die forgotten while my life savings funded Madison's next criminal enterprise. After Miller left, Madison busied herself in the kitchen while James settled into my recliner to watch television. I excused myself to my bedroom, claiming exhaustion from the day's activities, but instead of resting, I sat on my bed and studied the evidence Eleanor had helped me gather. The printed pages told a story of sophisticated criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple families across several states. Madison Melissa Hartwell and Robert Miller had perfected their system of legal theft, using conservatorship laws to strip elderly victims of their autonomy and assets while appearing to provide loving care. But now I knew the truth. The question was whether anyone would believe me before it was too late. James was already convinced that I needed help managing my life. Madison had isolated me from friends who might support my version of events, and Miller was preparing legal documents that would make my protests irrelevant. I looked around my bedroom, the same room where I'd nursed James through childhood illnesses, where I dreamed of his future success and happiness. The security camera mounted in the corner blinked red, recording my every movement for evidence in a legal case that would destroy everything I'd spent my lifetime building. Tomorrow, Miller would return with documents designed to sign away my freedom. And somewhere in my house, Madison was probably planning the next phase of an operation that had already claimed multiple victims across multiple states. The wedding photo on James's nightstand seemed to mock me through the darkness, a reminder that my son had married a predator who specialized in destroying families exactly like ours. I shuffled into the kitchen the next morning, my bathrobe hanging loose and my hair deliberately uncombed. Madison looked up from her coffee with that practiced expression of patient concern she'd perfected over the past weeks. The security camera in the corner blinked steadily, recording my performance for whatever legal case she was building. "Good morning, dear," Madison said, her voice honey-sweet. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," I mumbled, letting my words slur slightly. I kept forgetting where I was. This house feels so strange lately. Madison's eyes brightened with satisfaction. She reached for her legal pad, always nearby now, and made a note. Another piece of evidence for her incompetency file. "That's perfectly normal," she assured me, rising to guide me to a chair with gentle hands that felt like shackles. Memory issues can make familiar places seem confusing. James and I were just discussing how we might make you more comfortable. James nodded from behind his newspaper, accepting Madison's interpretation without question. He'd stopped looking at me directly over the past few days, as if my supposed decline was too painful to witness. My son was already mourning a mother who was sitting right in front of him, fully alert and fighting for her life. "Maybe some tea would help," Madison suggested, moving toward the kettle with practiced efficiency. I found a wonderful herbal blend that's supposed to be calming for seniors. Herbal blend. I watched her measure loose tea leaves into a strainer, wondering what else she might be adding to my morning routine. The victims from the online forum had mentioned unexplained drowsiness, missed appointments, periods of confusion that couldn't be explained by normal aging. "That's very thoughtful," I said, accepting the cup with hands I let tremble slightly. "You're such a good daughter-in-law." The compliment made Madison's smile widen. She was enjoying this performance, savoring each sign that her plan was working perfectly. But while she was documenting my supposed decline, I was documenting something else entirely. The tiny recording device Eleanor had helped me purchase was hidden in my bathrobe pocket, capturing every word of Madison's helpful suggestions and James's concerned responses. The miniature camera disguised as a brooch on my house dress was recording Madison's facial expressions when she thought I wasn't looking, moments when her mask slipped to reveal calculating satisfaction. After breakfast, I made my way slowly to the living room, playing the part of a confused elderly woman while actually positioning myself near the landline phone. Madison was in the guest room with James, discussing the legal documents Robert Miller would bring later that afternoon. I dialed the number Eleanor had given me, keeping my voice low and shaky. "Detective Morrison? This is Ruth Patterson. I think I need help." Detective Sarah Morrison arrived at my door 20 minutes later, disguised as a home health aide making a routine visit. She was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a gentle demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Patterson," she said loudly enough for any surveillance equipment to pick up, "I'm here to discuss your care options." But once we were seated in my living room with the television turned up to mask our conversation, Detective Morrison's tone became businesslike and urgent. "We've been tracking Melissa Hartwell and Robert Miller for 8 months, she said quietly. "They're suspects in similar cases in Arizona and Florida, but they've been careful to avoid prosecution by moving frequently and covering their tracks." I pulled out the evidence Eleanor and I had compiled printed pages of court records, victim testimonials, and financial documents showing the pattern of theft across multiple states. "This is exactly what we needed," Morrison said, scanning the documents. "But we need more than historical evidence. We need proof of active criminal behavior in your specific case." "What kind of proof?" Morrison leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We need evidence that shows criminal intent in your situation, recordings of them discussing their plans, documentation of fraud attempts, proof that they're manipulating your medical care or legal status for financial gain." I thought about Madison's phone calls, her suspicious research on my computer, the fake legal documents Miller was preparing. "I think I can get that evidence, but I'll need your help." Over the next hour, Morrison outlined a plan that would turn Madison's own methods against her. I would continue playing the confused elderly woman while secretly documenting everything they said and did. Morrison would monitor the situation from a distance, ready to intervene if things became dangerous. "The key is to make them confident enough to reveal their true intentions," Morrison explained. "Criminals like this become careless when they think they're in complete control." That afternoon, I put the plan into action. Using Eleanor's computer again, I reached out to the other victims I'd found on the Elder Fraud Survivors Forum. The responses came quickly. People who'd been waiting years for a chance to stop Melissa Hartwell from destroying more families. Margaret Chen from Arizona had lost her father and $300,000 to Melissa's scheme. David Williams from Florida had watched his mother die in a substandard care facility, while Melissa and Robert Miller drained her accounts. Patricia Garrett was William Garrett's daughter, the family Eleanor and I had read about in our initial research. "We've been building a case file for 2 years," Patricia wrote in her email response. "Every piece of evidence, every document, every witness statement. If you can prove active criminal behavior, we have enough historical evidence to ensure life sentences for both of them." Within hours, I had a network of allies sharing strategies and evidence through encrypted email accounts Eleanor helped me set up. They sent me recordings of conversations with Miller, photographs of forged documents, and detailed timelines showing how quickly Melissa could move from helpful caregiver to complete financial control. "She usually escalates quickly once the legal paperwork is in motion," Margaret warned in a phone call. "My father went from signing a simple power of attorney to being declared incompetent and institutionalized within 3 weeks. 3 weeks! Miller was coming today with documents he expected me to sign. The timeline was accelerating exactly as the other victims had predicted. But I had one more card to play a trap that would expose Madison's true motivations beyond any legal doubt. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad of my own, carefully handwriting a document I hoped would seal Madison's fate. The fake will was simple but effective. It left my entire estate to James, with specific provisions that would only take effect after my death. I made sure to include detailed listings of my assets. The house worth nearly $400,000, investment accounts totaling $200,000, life insurance policies worth another $100,000. The numbers were slightly inflated, designed to trigger maximum greed from someone who'd been systematically cataloging my financial situation. Then I did something that would have seemed foolish to anyone who didn't understand Madison's psychology. I left the will on my kitchen counter, partially hidden under some mail but clearly visible to anyone looking for it. Madison found it within hours. I was pretending to nap in my recliner when I heard her soft footsteps in the kitchen. Through barely opened eyes, I watched her discover the document, her body language shifting from casual browsing to intense focus as she read the contents. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the will not from emotion, but from excitement. Here was confirmation that her weeks of manipulation and performance had been worthwhile. The elderly woman she'd been systematically undermining was worth $750,000, all of it destined for the son she'd married and could easily control. Madison glanced around to make sure she was alone, then pulled out her phone and began photographing each page of the will. Her movements were quick, efficient, practiced. She'd done this before, many times, with other victims in other houses. But what Madison didn't know was that my fake will contained a legal trap designed by Detective Morrison and the network of previous victims. The document included specific language that would prove criminal intent if Madison tried to use the information to accelerate my death or incapacitation. Any attempt to reference the will's contents in legal proceedings before my natural death would constitute evidence of premeditated fraud. More importantly, Madison's photographs of the will were being captured by my own hidden camera, creating irrefutable evidence that she was documenting my assets for purposes that had nothing to do with loving care. "James," Madison called out after finishing her photography session, "could you come here for a minute?" My son appeared in the kitchen, still carrying the concerned expression that had become his default around me. "I found something troubling," Madison said, her voice heavy with false emotion. "Your mother left some documents out, and I think she's been trying to change her will without legal guidance." She showed him the fake will, watching his face carefully as he read through the asset listings and beneficiary information. "This is a lot more money than I thought Mom had," James said, his voice filled with surprise and something else. Hope, maybe. Or relief at discovering his inheritance would be substantial enough to solve his own financial struggles. "That's what concerns me," Madison replied smoothly. "These kinds of decisions shouldn't be made without proper legal counsel, especially given her recent confusion. What if she makes changes that aren't in her best interests, or yours?" The trap was working perfectly. Madison was using my fake will to manipulate James into supporting faster legal intervention, exactly as Detective Morrison had predicted. But every word of her manipulation was being recorded by devices she didn't know existed. "Maybe we should ask Robert Miller about this when he comes tomorrow," James suggested. "Actually," Madison said, her voice taking on that helpful tone I'd learned to dread, "I think we might need to move more quickly. Your mother's condition seems to be deteriorating faster than we expected. We don't want her making financial decisions that could hurt both of you, deteriorating faster than expected." Madison was already preparing to justify accelerated legal action based on my fake will. But as I listened to her convince my son that I needed immediate intervention, I realized she was preparing to do more than just speed up the conservatorship timeline. That night, after James and Madison had gone to their room, I lay in bed listening to the soft murmur of their conversation through the walls. But this time, instead of the gentle newlywed chatter I'd heard before, their voices carried a different urgency. Madison's tone was crisp, businesslike. The same voice I'd heard during her mysterious phone calls weeks earlier. "We need to accelerate the timeline," she said. "The will changes everything. If we can establish incompetency within the next week, James can challenge any recent modifications as products of diminished capacity." "I don't understand why we're rushing," James replied, his voice uncertain. "Mom seems to have good days and bad days. Maybe we should wait and see if she improves." "James, honey, your mother isn't going to improve. At her age, with these symptoms, the decline is only going to get worse. The kindest thing we can do is make sure she's protected before she makes decisions she'll regret." protected. Madison was using my fake will to convince James that stripping me of legal rights was an act of mercy rather than theft. But what if she fights the conservatorship? James asked. Madison's laugh was cold, calculating. Sweetheart, that's why we have the medication solution. A few adjustments to her evening tea, some additional herbal supplements, and she'll be much calmer during the legal proceedings. Miller says, confused. Sedated clients rarely object to arrangements that are obviously in their best interests. Medication solution. My blood turned to ice as I realized Madison wasn't just planning to steal my assets. She was planning to drug me into compliance, exactly as she'd done with previous victims. The conversation continued, but I could barely focus on the words. Madison was discussing dosages and timing, explaining to my son that small amounts of sedatives mixed into my food would make me more manageable during the legal proceedings that would strip away my rights. James's voice was hesitant, but not horrified. Are you sure that's safe? I don't want to hurt her. Of course it's safe, Madison assured him. It's just herbal supplements, natural calming agents. Miller has used similar approaches with other clients who were too agitated to understand what was best for them. Natural calming agents. Madison was convincing my son that drugging me was a kindness, that my resistance to their plans was a symptom of mental illness rather than rational self-defense. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, straining to hear every word of their conversation. But as the voices grew quieter, I realized that Madison was already implementing her medication solution. The herbal tea she'd been serving me, the special supplements she'd added to my meals. How long had she been drugging me without my knowledge? Tomorrow, Robert Miller would arrive with legal documents designed to make me a ward of the state. Madison would begin increasing whatever drugs she'd been giving me, ensuring I'd be too confused and sedated to fight effectively. And James would stand by watching, convinced he was protecting his mother from her own poor judgment. But Madison had made one crucial mistake. She'd accelerated her timeline without realizing I was no longer the helpless victim she thought she was controlling. Detective Morrison was monitoring the situation. The network of previous victims was standing by with evidence, and everything Madison had just revealed to James was being recorded by devices she didn't know existed. The war was about to begin, but this time, Madison had chosen the wrong battlefield. Madison crushed 2 white pills between a spoon and my kitchen counter. The powder dissolved into my evening tea like sugar, invisible, but deadly. She stirred with gentle motions, humming as if preparing a loving bedtime treat instead of drugging an elderly woman into submission. Here you go, Mrs. Patterson, she said, carrying the cup to my recliner. I found wonderful new vitamins for memory support. I dissolved them in your tea to make them easier to take. The lie rolled off her tongue smoothly, but this time I was ready. That's so thoughtful, dear, I said, accepting the cup with trembling hands. You take such good care of me. Madison's smile radiated satisfaction. She settled across from me, watching with predatory patience as I lifted the cup toward my lips. Her security camera blinked steadily, recording what she expected to be my final moments of lucidity. But my hidden recording device was capturing something more valuable. Madison's face as she watched an elderly woman drink what she believed was a sedative. I pretended to sip while pressing the cup against closed lips, letting liquid wet them without entering my mouth. The bitter chemical taste was unmistakable. This wasn't vitamins. This was pharmaceutical sedation designed to render me unconscious. How does it taste? Madison asked, her voice honey-sweet but eyes sharp. Wonderful, I murmured, setting down the cup as if my hands were too heavy. I'm feeling sleepy already. Madison leaned forward, studying my face for signs her drugs were working. I let my eyelids droop, mimicking forced sedation while remaining completely alert. Perfect, dear, Madison said softly. Just rest. James and I will take care of everything. James appeared in the doorway, concern creasing his face. How's Mom doing? Much better, Madison replied, never taking her eyes off my supposedly drugged form. The supplements are helping her relax. She should sleep peacefully tonight. While I appeared unconscious, I pressed a hidden button in my pocket, a silent alert summoning Detective Morrison immediately. 20 minutes passed. Madison occasionally checked my pulse or whispered my name. Each time, I remained perfectly still, perfectly vulnerable, according to her expectations. Then Madison's voice changed completely. "James, go check the doors are locked," she said, tone crisp and businesslike. "We need to talk." My son's footsteps retreated. Madison waited for the deadbolt, then moved closer to my recliner. "I know you can hear me," she said softly, voice devoid of sweetness. The confused act was clever, Ruth, but not clever enough. My blood turned to ice, but I maintained my unconscious posture. Madison thought her drugs had finally rendered me helpless. "You want the truth?" Madison continued with cold confidence. "Your son was marked from the beginning. I researched his family for months. Single mother, elderly with assets, isolated from family. Perfect targets. She was confessing everything, thinking I was too drugged to remember. But my recording device captured every word. James was so easy to manipulate," Madison said with cruel satisfaction. "A lonely man desperate for love, willing to believe anything about his poor, declining mother." James returned. Madison immediately shifted to her sweet voice. "She's resting comfortably. The medication is working perfectly." "Good," James said uncertainly. "I still feel bad about giving her drugs without her knowing." "It's herbal supplements to help her relax," Madison lied smoothly. "The lawyer comes early tomorrow," she continued. "Once your mother signs the power of attorney, we can arrange her long-term care. She'll be safer in a facility. Madison was planning to warehouse me while draining my assets, but she'd revealed her plan within range of recording devices she didn't know existed." Suddenly, James's voice changed. "Madison, what medication regimen?" I opened my eyes slightly, seeing my son stare at his wife with dawning horror. Something had finally penetrated his willful blindness. "Herbal supplements," Madison said quickly, but her confidence wavered. "You just talked about sedated clients," James said slowly. "What have you been giving my mother?" Madison's mask cracked under his unexpected questions. James was no longer the malleable husband she'd manipulated. He was becoming an angry son who realized he'd been used. Madison's composure snapped completely. "Fine," she said, voice ice cold. "Your mother is worth $750,000. All of it will be yours when she dies. But only if we establish legal control first." The confession hung in the air like poison. Madison had revealed her true motivation, greed for assets she'd been cataloging since moving into my home. "You married me for my mother's money?" James whispered. "I married you because you were the key to your mother's money," Madison corrected with brutal honesty. "Lonely men with elderly parents are my specialty, James." That's when car doors slammed in my driveway, multiple vehicles, footsteps marching with official purpose. Detective Morrison's voice carried through my door, amplified by bullhorn. "Federal agents! Open the door immediately!" Madison spun toward the window, face contorting with panic as her operation collapsed. I opened my eyes completely and sat up, fully alert. Because I told them everything, Melissa Hartwell. The use of her real name hit Madison like a physical blow. She staggered backward, understanding that the confused elderly woman had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. "I knew from the day you moved in," I said, standing with steady movements. "Every piece of evidence you thought you were gathering against me, I was gathering against you." The front door burst open. Detective Morrison entered with federal agents in tactical gear. "Melissa Hartwell," Morrison announced, "you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and aggravated assault." As agents moved to handcuff Madison, she turned to James with desperate pleading. "James, you have to believe me. I love you." But James stepped away like she was radioactive. My name is James Patterson, and I don't know who you are." Madison was dragged toward the door in handcuffs, her composure finally shattered. But as she reached the threshold, she turned back with pure, undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice carrying a promise that made my blood run cold. The agents pulled her toward waiting vehicles, but Madison's final words echoed in my living room like a curse. I'd won this battle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her war against my family had only just begun. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain when I watched Detective Morrison emerge from the federal building, her face grim but satisfied. She carried a manila folder thick with documents evidence that would put Madison away for decades. Behind her, a parade of prosecutors and federal agents filed out, their expressions telling the story of a case that had grown far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. "Mrs. Patterson," Detective Morrison called out, spotting me near the courthouse entrance. "We need to talk." I followed her to a coffee shop across the street where she spread the contents of her folder across a corner table. Court documents, financial records, victim testimonies. The paper trail of Madison's criminal career covered every available inch of space. The grand jury returned indictments in 4 states. Morrison began, her finger tracing across a legal document with official seals. 18 counts of elder fraud, 12 counts of conspiracy, 8 counts of identity theft, and 6 counts of aggravated assault. She's looking at life without parole. Life without parole. The words should have brought satisfaction, but instead I felt a strange emptiness. Madison would never hurt another family, but the families she'd already destroyed would never fully recover from her crimes. "What about Robert Miller?" I asked. Morrison's smile was sharp. Miller flipped the moment we showed him the evidence. "He's testifying against Madison in exchange for a reduced sentence." She pulled out a transcript of Miller's confession. According to him, they've been running this operation for 5 years, across 7 states. Madison would target the victims, establish control, and Miller would handle the legal theft through fraudulent conservatorship proceedings. I scanned Miller's testimony, reading his cold clinical description of how they'd systematically destroyed elderly people's lives for profit. They'd perfected a system that appeared completely legitimate on paper while stripping vulnerable seniors of every right and asset they'd spent lifetimes accumulating. "The total amount stolen is over $2 million, Morrison continued. "But that's just the money we can trace. Madison was careful about covering her tracks, and some of her earlier victims died before their families realized what had happened. Some of her earlier victims died." I thought about William Garrett, the elderly man whose story Eleanor and I had found during our research. Madison had isolated him from family, controlled his medications, and systematically drained his assets while he slowly deteriorated under her so-called care. "How many victims were there?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Morrison consulted another document, at least 12 families that we can prove, but Madison's been moving frequently using different aliases in each state. The FBI suspects there may be twice that number. 24 families. Madison had potentially destroyed the lives of dozens of elderly people and their children, using love as a weapon and law as a tool for theft. The scope of her crimes was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. "There's something else," Morrison said, lowering her voice. "Miller's testimony revealed that this isn't an isolated operation. There's a network of people running similar schemes nationwide. Madison was part of something much larger than we initially realized, a network. Madison hadn't been working alone. She'd been part of an organized system of predators targeting vulnerable seniors across the entire country. My case had uncovered just one tentacle of something that reached into communities everywhere. When I returned home, I found James sitting at my kitchen table with his head in his hands. He looked like he'd aged years in the weeks since Madison's arrest. The confident man who defended his wife against his own mother had been replaced by someone hollow, broken, struggling to understand how completely he'd been deceived. "The FBI came by earlier," he said, without looking up. They wanted to know if I was involved in Madison's scheme. I sat down across from him, studying my son's face for signs of the James I'd raised. What did you tell them? The truth. That I was an idiot who fell in love with a criminal and nearly helped her destroy my own mother. His voice cracked on the last words. Mom, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to even begin apologizing for what I put you through. Sorry. The words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of betrayal we'd both experienced. James had chosen Madison over me repeatedly, dismissed my concerns, participated in her gaslighting campaign, and enabled her systematic isolation of me from friends and medical care. You believed someone you loved, I said carefully. Madison was a professional manipulator. She studied how to exploit people's emotions and weaknesses. But you saw through her from the beginning, James protested. You tried to warn me, and I called you paranoid and jealous. I chose her over you every single time. Every single time. The pattern had been consistent from the moment Madison entered our lives. James had accepted her explanations for my behavior, agreed with her assessments of my mental state, and supported her recommendations for my care-all while I was screaming silently that something was desperately wrong. She targeted your loneliness, I said, though the words felt like pulling splinters from an open wound. Madison researched our family, identified your vulnerabilities, and exploited them systematically. You weren't the first person she manipulated, and you wouldn't have been the last. James finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. How do you live with that? Knowing that someone studied you like a lab rat and found exactly the right buttons to push. The question hung between us like a bridge we'd both have to cross. James was asking how to rebuild a sense of self after discovering that his deepest emotions had been weaponized against him. But I was wondering the same thing. How do you trust your own judgment after realizing you'd welcomed a predator into your home? 3 weeks later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching Madison face her victims for the first time since her arrest. The woman who'd once controlled every situation now sat hunched at the defendant's table, her expensive clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that stripped away every trace of her former elegance. Jessica Morgan took the witness stand first, her voice steady as she described watching her father deteriorate under Madison's care. She convinced me that Dad needed constant supervision, that his confusion was getting dangerous. I trusted her because she seemed so competent, so caring. I never suspected she was drugging him to keep him compliant while she stole everything he'd worked for. Patricia Garrett followed, her testimony even more devastating. Madison isolated my father from everyone who might have questioned her version of his condition. She canceled his doctor appointments, intercepted his mail, and told his friends he was too confused for visitors. When he died, she'd already transferred most of his assets to accounts she controlled. One by one, Madison's victims shared their stories. The pattern was identical in every case: systematic isolation, documented decline, legal theft disguised as compassionate care. But seeing the human cost of Madison's crimes, hearing the voices of families she'd destroyed, transformed her from a criminal defendant into something monstrous. I watched Madison's face throughout the testimony, looking for signs of remorse or recognition of the pain she'd caused. Instead, she sat with practiced stillness, her expression blank and professional even in defeat. The woman who'd perfected the art of manipulating emotions showed none of her own. When it was my turn to testify, I looked directly at Madison for the first time since her arrest. She met my gaze with cold calculation, even now studying me for weaknesses she might exploit. The defendant systematically undermined my relationship with my son, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. She isolated me from friends, intercepted my communications, and began drugging me to make me compliant for legal proceedings that would have stripped away my rights and assets. Madison's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Recordings of her confessions, documentation of her drug administration, proof of her financial reconnaissance. Everything I'd gathered with Detective Morrison's help painted a picture of premeditated elder abuse. She didn't just steal money, I continued. She stole relationships, dignity, and peace of mind. She turned my son against me and nearly succeeded in convincing him that loving care meant signing his mother's life away to strangers. As I spoke, I watched Madison's composure finally begin to crack. The predator who'd fed on other people's trust was being systematically dismantled by her own victims, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of truth. When the judge announced Madison's sentence 25 years to life without possibility of parole, she showed no emotion. But as the bailiffs moved to escort her from the courtroom, she turned to look at me one final time. "You think you've won," she said, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the silent courtroom. "But there are dozens of others doing exactly what I did, and they're smarter now because of what you taught them. Dozens of others." Madison's final words confirmed what Detective Morrison had told me. This case had exposed just one operation in a nationwide network of predators targeting vulnerable seniors. The bailiffs pulled Madison through the courtroom door, but her warning echoed in my mind long after she'd disappeared. Somewhere across the country, other families were experiencing what James and I had survived. Other elderly people were being isolated, drugged, and systematically robbed by criminals who'd perfected Madison's techniques. After the sentencing, Detective Morrison approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Mrs. Patterson, we've been contacted by law enforcement agencies in 12 states. They want your help identifying similar operations in their jurisdictions." 12 states. Madison's arrest had triggered a national investigation into elder abuse networks, and authorities needed someone who understood the predator's methods from a victim's perspective. "What would that involve?" I asked. "Consulting on cases, training investigators to recognize the patterns, maybe testifying in other prosecutions. You're uniquely qualified to help law enforcement protect other families from what you experienced." I looked through the courthouse windows at the parking lot where James waited for me, probably rehearsing another apology he didn't know how to deliver. We'd both survived Madison's assault on our family, but the scars would take years to heal. "There are more people like Madison out there right now," Morrison continued, "and there are more families like yours who don't realize they're being targeted until it's too late. More families like mine. Somewhere tonight, an elderly person was wondering why their adult child seemed different, why helpful suggestions felt like control, why their independence was disappearing piece by piece under the guise of loving care. "I'll do it," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "If my experience can help stop other predators, I'll do whatever is necessary." Detective Morrison smiled and handed me her card. "I'll be in touch within the week. The FBI wants to start with cases in California and Texas. We think Madison's network has operations in both states." As I walked toward the parking lot where James waited, I realized that Madison's final threat had been more prophetic than she'd intended. She was right that this wasn't over, but not because her associates would target me again. It wasn't over because I was going to spend however many years I had left making sure other families never experienced what we'd survived. Madison had created a warrior when she'd tried to create a victim, and that warrior was just getting started. The coffee maker gurgled to life at 6:30, same as every morning for 25 years. I stood in my kitchen breathing in the rich aroma-real coffee this time, not the drugged version Madison had served me. 6 months had passed since her sentencing, and for the first time in what felt like years, I experienced something I'd almost forgotten peace. James sat at my kitchen table reading the newspaper. He'd moved back in temporarily, not as Madison's puppet, but as my son, working to rebuild the trust he'd shattered. Some mornings were harder than others. Some days, the guilt in his eyes was almost unbearable. "Mom," he said softly, pointing at a headline, "there's an article about the Elder Protection Act passing in Congress. It mentions you. I smiled. My testimony had helped pass legislation strengthening protections for seniors against financial predators. Madison's arrest had been just the beginning. I'd become an advocate, working with law enforcement to stop similar schemes nationwide. The broken coffee cup from that first morning had been replaced, but I kept the memory. It reminded me when my old life shattered and my new one began. Madison had underestimated a grieving mother's determination, mistaking age for weakness and isolation for helplessness. Detective Morrison still called weekly with updates. Madison's criminal network had been dismantled completely. Robert Chen was serving 15 years. 3 other victims had recovered their stolen assets. The woman who destroyed so many families would spend her life behind bars, where her charm couldn't hurt anyone else. James reached across the table and touched my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, as he had every day for 6 months. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." I squeezed his fingers. Forgiveness was a choice I made daily, not a feeling that came naturally. But love, real love, not Madison's manipulative imitation, required that choice. "You were lonely," I said. "She knew exactly how to use that against you. That's what predators do." The house felt different now. Madison's changes had all been undone, but more importantly, the fear was gone. I'd learned something valuable during those dark months. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. At 71, I'd faced down a criminal, saved my own life, and protected countless other families from Madison's schemes. The wedding photo was gone, replaced by a picture of me receiving a community service award. But sometimes, late at night, I still thought about Madison's final words. "This isn't over." Let her think that. I'd spent months learning about predators, studying their patterns, understanding their weaknesses. I'd built a network of survivors, law enforcement contacts, and advocacy groups. If Madison somehow found a way to threaten me again, I'd be ready. The old Ruth might have been an easy target, isolated, trusting, unprepared for evil, wearing a friendly face. But Madison had created something she never intended, a warrior. I discovered that the greatest strength comes not from avoiding betrayal, but from surviving it. And that lesson was worth everything I'd been through. The coffee was perfect. The morning was beautiful. And I was finally, truly free.